What is up, guys, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to teach you my top 10 tips for building winning decks in Pokemon trading card game Pocket. I'm going to start with the most basic tips and then end with more advanced tips. So make sure to stick around to the end so you don't miss out on anything that will help you win more often and have more fun in this game. So for tip number 1, if you have no idea how to build a deck and you don't know where to start, I would recommend starting with a rental deck. Pick one of the rental or theme decks that are available. There are a ton of them out there, and just spend some time playing around with it. Find out what works, what you like about the deck, what you don't like about it, and after you've had some experience, found out that maybe Morlul isn't the most useful card in this deck, or you really like the superior line, then you can go into your deck builder, which you can find by clicking on cards, decks, and then build new, and you can click build from theme deck list. Go to Mythical Island here, click on Celebi or whichever one it was that you were using, click on build this deck. That'll copy the deck, and then you can go in here and decide what you liked. So say we decided we didn't want the Morlul line. We can click on these and remove it from there, and then you can go in and edit it with cards that you think will be more useful. For example, adding a second Superior would make this deck much better. Tip number 2 is probably the next easiest option. Go to build new deck, click on the plus here and click on auto build, and then just decide what kind of deck you want to build. Let's say here we're trying to go for a dragon deck. We want to see how to use Dragonite. Click on that and it will auto build a deck here. And then what you can do is you can look through these cards, see what you like, what you don't like, edit it around, or even if you're not sure, you don't know what's good, and you'll learn in this video in our later tips which cards you should include and which you shouldn't. But if you want to play around with it, just battle with this deck, play around with it, and if you see that Druddigon keeps being kind of useless, then you can remove him and replace him with something more useful, maybe like the Frostmoth line or Wigglytuff. And this idea of trial and error and playing around with some basic easy builds that the game has already given you is definitely one of the best ways to start deck building. Now tip number 3 is where we really start getting into the practical tips here, and that is to use less evolution lines. One of the big problems with a lot of the decks out there, and especially the theme decks, is they just have too many evolution lines that you can't rely on one strategy. Pokemon TCG Pocket is meant to be a fast game, and because of that, you really need to have just one strategy and shoot for that. So for example, if you're going for Celebi EX here, you don't really want to pair it with Exeggutor and Morlul. That's just way too much. What would be a much better strategy is to just hone in on setting up Celebi EX with Superior as its supporter, and just include these 2 evolution lines. If you want to have Delmice as a backup here to tank, that's totally okay, and that is one of the more common deck builds, but sometimes that even can just get in the way, and I would recommend just adding in a Celebi, adding in Superior, and then filling everything else up with just useful item and supporter cards, which we'll talk about next. So tip number 4 is to use the right item and supporter cards, and there are definitely some that are way better than others. So in my opinion, you should always use 2 Pokeballs and 2 Professor's Research. These allow you to filter through your cards more quickly and get to the ones you want. Like I said, the entire battle strategy in Pokemon TCG Pocket is built around speed. You want to get to your powerhouse Pokemon, and with this example that's Celebi, as soon as possible and get it set up. So Pokeball and Professor's Research will allow you to draw Celebi more quickly. X Speed is also a great one if you need to switch out. If you're playing with a Psychic deck, I would always include 2 Mythical Slab, 2 Pokeballs, and 2 Professor's Research. If you do that, you are pretty much guaranteed to fill up all of your Pokemon within almost no time at all. And so you'll be able to set up much faster than your opponent, which gives you a very high chance of winning. And then if you have different style decks, certain cards can be more useful. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but for example, Erica is great if you have a grass type deck. Misty is a powerhouse with water decks, but we'll focus more on that a little bit later. If this has been useful so far, please consider hitting that subscribe button. We're really pushing for 10K subscribers, and we'd love to have you as part of the team. Tip number 5 is starting to get into the more advanced tips here, and this is to start with a goal in mind when you build your deck. You want to build your deck around a certain strategy, and then pick every single card in the deck around that strategy. So for example, if you want a healing deck, you can go for Venusaur EX paired with Erica and 2 potions, and then something that has a low energy cost like Exeggutor EX, and this will allow you to heal very quickly and be bulky. But the idea here is that every single card in the deck is built around our strategy of being bulky, healing, and outlasting our opponent. Another strategy is to build a fast deck. A great example of this is the Blaine aggro deck, where you just go with Vulpix, Ponyta, Ninetales, and Rapidash. Very low energy cost, single evolutions, and then you just have cards to try and rip through as fast as possible, use Blaine, and take out your opponent's Pokemon before they can be fully set up. And there are a ton of different strategies that we can focus on in other videos. And there are countless different strategies that you can use in Pokemon Pocket, but the idea is that every card will be built around that strategy or around a specific card that you want to use. So for example, I'm sure you've all seen the Mewtwo EX deck that focuses on Gardevoir and Rowlet's and powering it up. This deck has a very clear and simple goal, and everything is built towards it. So you'll use Pokeball, you'll use Professor's Research, you'll use Mythical Slab. Then you can throw in Mew EX with Budding Expeditioner, and this entire deck is just going to be focused on getting Mewtwo out there as soon as possible, getting Gardevoir powered up, and then Gardevoir can power up Mewtwo so that he can use his most powerful attack every turn. And when you do that, it's hard to beat, and I'm sure many of you have encountered this deck. Too often people try to combine different strategies, and with a game as fast as Pokemon TCG Pocket, putting multiple strategies together just doesn't always work that well. It's much better to focus in on one simple strategy and only add cards to your deck that help with that strategy. Tip number 6 is an interesting one, but it's actually incredibly effective. And that is, if you lose to a deck, I want you to be analytical and think about why, and consider copying that deck. All right, now not copying for copying's sake, but if you find that you're coming into multiple decks and every time you find this deck, it beats you, whether it's Celebi EX or Mewtwo EX, or some more interesting combo like Greninja with Starmie, then I recommend actually copying that deck and trying it out, right? There's a lot of power in learning from other people, and so that's one of the best ways to do well in this game, is if you start to see that other decks are performing better, try them out, and then think about what makes that deck better than the deck you're using, and then you can start building different decks with a similar strategy because you've started to realize what makes a deck do well. Tip number 7 is actually one that is involved in this deck that I'm using right now that I love to use to counter Celebi EX and Mewtwo EX, and that is to not use EX cards. Now obviously EX cards are very powerful, and so you can and should use them often. However, when you're just starting out, sometimes it can be really beneficial to not use EX cards, because that way if you happen to lose one of your Pokemon, if you're not really sure about how to play the game, if your strategy isn't nailed down yet, it's not as high risk. Because when you're playing with an EX Pokemon, as soon as that Pokemon gets knocked out, you lose 2 points, which is absolutely huge. With a lot of decks, it's pretty easy to get 1 point, and so if they're able to get that EX Pokemon out, you're in big trouble. However, if you're playing with a deck like this one right here, where you don't have an EX Pokemon, if you lose one Pokemon, it's not the end of the world, and it gives you some time to recover, to think about your strategy a little bit more, and to learn to play the game, and helps you to win more often. And so this is definitely one of my favorite tips. Try and build decks without EX Pokemon. It also makes the game a little bit more fun. It's a little bit of a challenge, and you'll build decks that people aren't as used to playing, so sometimes they don't know how to counter well. For example, this guy right here probably thinks he's pretty safe. He's got Celebi set up, but very few people will use Scolipede in the game, and so he may not even realize that Scolipede can easily one-shot Celebi when he's poisoned. And I just took out his EX Pokemon. He's now down 2 points. I'm only down 1, and his superior is not set up at all, and so this will be a pretty easy win for me. As a bonus tip, I just did a live stream about this deck right here and how it can help to counter Celebi EX, and so make sure to check that out if you'd like to build this deck. If you're tired of losing to Celebi EX, it's a great counter. And that leads right into tip number 8, which is to look for cards that can easily counter current meta decks. So like I said, one of the most meta decks right now is Celebi EX. I'm sure many of you have played against it and got frustrated about how often you play against it. And so try and think about, what are Celebi EX's weaknesses? What are some cards that can counter it? And now Weezing, using Koga and going into Scolipede, is an absolutely great counter. As you can just see right here, we're able to take out this Celebi deck pretty easily. And that's because it's focused on taking down Celebi and Mew. This deck right here was built just to take down Celebi and Mew because I was tired of playing against Celebi and Mew so often. And so one of the best strategies out there, especially with a game like Pokemon Pocket where it is right now, there aren't as many cards. More cards are going to come out in the future, but for now, there's only so many deck options, and it seems like most people are just going with the ones they've seen on the internet, namely Celebi and Mew. So if you can think about their weaknesses and cards that can counter them, even if it doesn't seem like the most powerful deck at first, you can win a lot because it's directly focused on beating the most common decks. Now tip number 9 is similar to that, but it's really to experiment and try and see what works. And sometimes it's not going to work and you have to be okay with that. For example, I got really excited about this deck that I tried to build. I thought it would be the ultimate troll deck. You could use Pharaoh to get Pokemon to discard an energy and Wigglytuff to put them to sleep. But honestly, it did not work well at all. I was very excited about this, but after trying out with this deck, I decided to switch and try out Starmie with Wigglytuff, and this deck performed phenomenally. I was able to win a ton of battles with this. This is how I got the 5 in a row emblem, and it is by far one of my favorite decks I've ever used. And I only came up with it because I was experimenting. So just have fun with the game, experiment, try new decks. Sometimes when you do it, you're going to lose and the deck won't be very good. But if you keep coming with it, you're going to learn how to play the game better, build decks better, and you're going to come across some really fun decks that no one's ever faced. And the nice thing is when people haven't faced a deck like this, they don't know what to expect, and it gives you a huge advantage. Now those are the top 9 tips, and I hope all of these have been helpful to you. But if you're still unsure how to build a good deck or not sure where to start, tip number 10 will definitely help you. Tip number 10, my best tip for building good decks in Pokemon TCG Pocket, is to check out the playlist that I have where I post a different deck idea every single week. You can find it right here. This is a great place to get started with interesting deck ideas, and in all of these videos, I teach you my thought process behind building the decks, and this will help you to learn how to build better decks yourself.